And so this is part of my walk with him, is investigating the questions that I have and studying. But I think God made every person to know him as deeply as that person can. And for
Yeah.
every person, that pursuit will look different. So I think a
Yes.
lot about Jesus, telling us to approach him like children, and blessed are those who can approach him like children. That means, in part, I mean, that doesn't mean to never ask questions and to just have blind faith and don't
Sure.
think about it. But I think that means, count it joy if you if you can be content with maybe a quieter thought life. You're not a better person if you have a deeper, more angsty faith than I do.
Hi, everybody. So, what do you think? Does your mind and your intellect play a role in the development of your faith? Can you really get to know God from both learning His Word and from observing His world? Or does it even really matter? And what does this whole topic, this whole idea of mind and faith say about God and about us? Today's guest has a refreshingly deep perspective on the way the life of the mind interacts with the life of faith. Voices of WIA is just one of the many ways that we strive to educate, equip, and encourage women in Christian apologetics. If you love Voices of WIA, then I invite you to join our free email community where you'll receive apologetic resources every single week and enjoy community-only benefits like exclusive digital guides and a discount to our annual conference. You can sign up today by visiting womeninapologetics.com/email-community. Maria Baer is a reporter, writer, and podcaster. She is the co-host of the weekly Breakpoint This Week podcast with John Stonestreet, and she's a writer for Breakpoint. She is also published regularly at Christianity Today magazine, World Magazine, and the Gospel Coalition. She's based in Columbus, Ohio, and graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism from the Ohio University Scripps School of Journalism in 2009. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, Maria. I am so glad that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of what you guys are doing here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. Let's start by having you tell our audience just kind of how you got your start in the faith. How did you come to Jesus? And let us know what that looks like.
Sure. So I grew up in a Catholic family who
Okay.
took their faith, and still do take their faith very seriously. So I went to Catholic grade school, went to mass. We read the Bible occasionally,
Mhm.
but it was always just in our water as a family. So I'd always
Mhm.
grown up learning about Jesus, and had my first communion when I was 8,
Mhm.
and went to confession and did all of those things. But it was really in high school. I had a couple of friends. I went to a public school. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio. And I had a friend in school who was a very strong believer. She was not Catholic, and started sort of challenging me just to read the Bible. Nothing really more than that, but just, hey, do you know this story? Do you know that story? And I would say, for the most part, I knew kind of the greatest hits. I knew about Jonah, and I knew about Daniel, and all the flannel graph stories. And I would say I knew the New Testament very well. And I had a deep prayer life at that point, but it was
Oh,
more mystical. I think it was more, just embracing the mystery of the whole thing than it was a personal relationship, I think. So
okay.
I started really reading the Bible at the prompting of this friend. And you know, I I know that Jesus comes to everybody in different ways, and he says to us what we need to hear when we need to hear it, I think. And believe it or not, the verse that I remember still, like where I was in my room reading this, was in Mark 8, when Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, they have to pick up their cross and follow me. And, those who would save their life will lose it. And I read that now as an adult, I see the challenge, obviously. It's a very challenging and costly verse. At the time, I remember thinking, I was probably around 16, I can't believe somebody wants me that much. And,
Mm.
I was always a really passionate, sort of outgoing kid. My parents would have called me dramatic, which, to be fair, I was very dramatic. They were not wrong. But I guess by that point in my life, I had the sense that I was a little bit too much for most people. I needed to quiet down a little bit, that kind of thing. So this
Yeah.
verse meant so much to me because it felt like Jesus saying, "No, I want all of that. I want all of your passions and drama and personality, and that's how important it is." That just meant a lot to me at that time in my life. So
Yeah.
from then on, I just kept reading the Bible. My sweet grandfather, who was also a very devoted Catholic, survivor of World War II, he bought me a magazine subscription to a devotional. So for several years, he would give this to me every Christmas. He would renew it for the next year. I was getting these daily devotionals in the mail, and that really fostered my Bible reading. Um, since then, I'll just say really quickly, I started to have some real conviction about maybe leaving the Catholic Church. There were just some differences that I
Mhm.
saw in the Bible, and the way that things were being practiced. And my
Mhm.
sweet and really wise parents just told me, as long as you live with us, we want you to come to mass. But if you want to go to another church as well, you are perfectly able to do that. They wanted me to have a relationship with Jesus. So
Mm.
I went to both for the rest of my high school life. And then, since then, I'll still go to mass with my family when I'm with them, but I don't go to a Catholic church anymore.
Okay. Okay. So that actually sounds like a lot of us, I think, kind of growing up with just some sense of Christianity. And then
Mhm.
at some point, something happens for you. It was this friend
Mhm.
that you kind of owned it for yourself, sounds like. So after that, once you left high school, what was the catalyst for you to start thinking in terms of applying your faith to all of life and not just a Sunday thing or a spiritual thing or a personal thing, but the idea that faith sort of should invade all aspects of life? Can you tell us kind of how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happened gradually. I think it happened over
Yeah,
time. I'm sure that's
sure.
true for a lot of us as well. So I studied journalism at Ohio University, which is a very secular school. It was always a point of pride for Ohio U that we were always voted one of the top 5 party schools in the country. So not exactly a point of pride for me necessarily, but I did have a wonderful experience there. There's a
Good.
small, really thriving Christian community at Ohio U. That's actually where I met my husband, was in this Christian group there called Reach Out on campus. But my junior year in high school, every journalism student there has to have an internship at a publication. And I
Okay.
had grown up reading Brio magazine from Focus on the Family. My parents loved Focus on the Family, and so I had been reading that from when I was maybe 11 or 12, and I'd always loved it. And so I thought maybe I'll try to get an internship at Brio, and I
Oh,
did. And so I was able to go out to Focus on the Family for, I think it was the fall semester of my junior year. And part of the internship at Brio magazine was having, what the way Focus on the Family structured it was that in the morning we would have these sort of practicum classes. It was almost like worldview classes. And then in the afternoon, I think there was about 100 of us there. In the
hmm.
afternoon, we'd all go to our separate internships around the organization at Focus. And mine, of course, was at Brio. But these morning classes were really formative for me. I took
Okay.
a worldview class with Del Tackett, who maybe some of your listeners will be familiar with, the Truth Project, which was sort of
Oh,
his
yeah.
curriculum on applying your faith to all of life. But I also remember another one of our teachers in these practicum classes telling us one day, Christians should be the first ones showing up to volunteer at, nursing homes and at, homes for, nonprofits for people who have mental disabilities. Or he was
Right.
kind of imploring us to volunteer and to be part of our communities in more ways than just you should read your Bible in your room every morning, which
Yeah.
also you should do. But I
Yeah.
hadn't ever heard anybody put it that way. when I got back to Ohio after that internship, I started volunteering. And I would say that was the beginning of a sort of rubber meets the road. Like, am I really going to live like this?
Right.
Kind of for me.
Yeah. I can totally understand that because I kind of had the same experience. I was at a church that was very good, and I'm very thankful that they were adamant that we should read our Bibles, that was truth,
Mhm.
and that we should read our Bibles. And it was not only should we, but that it was our responsibility to read our Bibles, because that's how we know how to follow God, and that's how we know who God is, and that's how we understand kind of our way through life. But they also made it clear that we should do, service type projects. But I really did think for the longest time that as long as I just showed up and did whatever service project that our youth group did, that I was sort of good. It really wasn't until much later that I understood exactly what, I think it's Dr. Tackett, is it Dale Tackett? What he was telling you is that that's supposed to be a lifestyle. That
Yeah.
serving is supposed to be a lifestyle. You're supposed to incorporate that into your life the same way that you incorporate personal Bible study into your life.
Sure. And it's we might think about it as like we're here, Christians should be showing up and serving in these ways because the world really needs us to serve them. And there is certainly truth to that. There are
Sure.
needy people, and God, the Bible clearly describes God as a creator who has a deep care and compassion for every person that he made. And so there
Right.
is truth to that. But I think we shouldn't downplay the fact that one of the reasons God asks us to serve each other like that is because of how it changes our own hearts and how it
Yeah.
changes, the way we view our own situation. It is a road towards humility and
Sure.
long suffering and compassion and,
Absolutely.
you know, gaining a heart that looks more like Jesus's.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Okay. So then you've gone through this class because of this internship, which is related to your college studies.
Mhm.
And then how did you come to a place, or at what point does apologetics kind of come onto the scene? How do you see that playing a role in the life of a faithful disciple? Just like we would, take our personal devotional efforts and our service. How does apologetics, where did that come into play? How did you add that in?
I think part of it is the way I'm wired. So, and my husband is this way too, and we really this is part of the reason we clicked and why we still do, is
Yeah.
because we're always asking questions, playing devil's advocate. Um, my husband likes to say that if somebody zigs, we will zag, and that's just we're contrarian by nature, but I think in a good way. And so, I always had questions about the Lord and faith. And, ever since first starting to really read the Bible seriously in high school, I do remember in college reading a book about Mother Teresa, and it was sort of a
Mhm.
collection of her letters. It's funny, I look back on that book now and wonder, I almost regret that it was published because I don't think she would have liked to have those letters published. But it revealed kind of the hidden side of her life, which she notoriously now people know. Um, she had a really dark sort of depression, or at least a
Mhm.
depressed presence in her life for a lot of her later years. So she served with great compassion and fidelity to people and to her calling. She loved Jesus, but she told a lot of people, including her kind of faith advisors, that she felt like she never heard from the Lord again for decades after he had called
Huh.
her to that service. And that book threw me. I was like, is that possible in this? Is it possible to serve God and to love God and to feel sad still? And I remember meeting with a pastor about it, and you know, just through that book, and then, going on through more experiences in my own life and just seeing suffering play out around the world, you're always asking, at least I'm always asking questions. Like every day you wake up and you encounter the world, and you've got to take what you see and learn and work it into your own worldview.
Mhm.
My boss, John, at the Colson Center will say, the danger comes when you do it the other way around. If you have, he would call it ideology versus worldview. If you have an ideology, you've decided you know everything, and then you wake up and you're going to force whatever you learn about the world to fit
Mhm.
into your ideology. Then you're going to miss a
Right.
lot of things, and you're going to get a lot of stuff wrong. But if you approach the world as, you're open to what you're going to see and learn every day, and you integrate that into your view of the world, I have had a Christian worldview since I was 16, and so far everything I've ever seen or read about or experienced has fit into that. Not always neatly, and a lot of that work is asking questions and is hard and painful, but I mean, I
Yeah.
think what apologetics is.
Yeah. I do too. I'm actually the opposite of that. I never really asked a whole lot of questions. I
Okay,
ask them now, but I never asked a whole lot of questions. I was just an easy sell. I just loved the whole idea that God loved me and Jesus died for me, and I was like, yeah, great, I'm in. So I never
right.
asked a whole lot of questions, but um, I do think that sometimes apologetics, most of us don't know what apologetics is or really kind of seek after it until whatever that moment is, that all of a sudden you need it and you don't have it. So your kids are
Mhm,
coming to you asking questions, or you experience some sort of profound loss in your life or a challenge in your life, and that prompts you to start asking the difficult questions. And then at that point, all of a sudden you want to know how much truth, how much reality is there really that weighs down these things that you've been taught your whole life, and how sturdy and enduring, how durable is it really. And so I never asked a whole lot of questions. I just sort of always operated on the assumption that Christianity was real.
yes.
However, there was a point at my life. There was a point, like a lot of people do. I went through a really hard time. I never really walked away from my faith,
Mhm,
but I certainly got really sloppy at living it, and experienced the consequences of that. And
mhm.
eventually, when I came back to building my faith, I was just lucky that somebody at my church was teaching apologetics. I didn't even know the word. I hadn't heard it. I don't even know that he used the word. But it was so interesting to me when I started studying. The class was called How Do We Know the Bible is the Bible? And it was so interesting to me because I had just started picking the Bible back up and really reading it when I was taking this class.
Mm,
And so at the same time that I'm up in the morning, kind of the light bulbs going off, connecting dots, really understanding why it is that my Sunday school teachers have taught me all these stories, the
mhm,
greatest hits that you call them. I love
mhm,
that.
mhm.
I was kind of connecting the dots. Oh, this is why this matters. This is why this is important. This looks like that later on. And then at the same time, this my pastor's teaching me that there's evidence to show that all these things are real. They really happened. The words are real. The manuscripts are reliable, and it just gave me such weight and gravity at a time when I was rebuilding my faith. And the reason I bring that all up is because I think one of the things we overlook, particularly today, is that there is great benefit in studying apologetics before you actually need to deploy them in your own life. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that are, if you agree with that or don't agree with that, and what your thoughts are in general on that.
100%. So I have 2 daughters. They're 8 and 6, and my 8-year-old recently discovered the concept of the trust fall. Do you know what this is? I don't know
Oh,
where
yes,
she's
sure.
heard of this, but, like, they
Yeah.
do this at when they're, like, doing corporate team building exercises or whatever. It's where
Yeah.
somebody stands behind you, you're both facing the same direction, so you can't see them, and then you're supposed to fall backwards and let them catch you. And it
Right.
is hard. I mean, my it took my daughter 5 tries to get her to finally do it with me behind her, and if anybody's gonna catch you, your mom's gonna catch you.
For
Um,
sure.
so now she thinks it's funny and just walks around the house randomly trust falling into you, which isn't as as you might need to let people know ahead of time that you're gonna do that. But I sort of think of it like that, where,
Yes.
you could kind of theoretically start to read the Bible, start to learn about apologetics in a theoretical way, which is helpful and for me a lot of fun. Like it's just an intellectual exercise, which is great. And so I guess this would be you saying, "Oh, I see that person over there who would catch somebody if they fell into them."
Sure.
That does appear to be real. There is somebody over there. The Where the rubber meets the road is when you're actually falling. And it makes a difference how you react when you're falling, whether you've decided beforehand to believe that someone's standing behind you and whether you feel that
Mm.
you've seen that evidence or whatever. And I think a lot of people, everyone has to have that moment in their life where they find themselves actually falling and they have to ask, do I really think this is true? Do I
Yeah,
actually think somebody's standing behind me? And that's just the nature of being human. It's going to happen for everybody. But I think it will be a blessing if you had spent the time beforehand to decide what you believed about the person that's supposed to catch you. Is he
yeah,
standing or not? It will be harder and scarier to make that decision in the crisis moment than it will
absolutely.
beforehand. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I have found looking backward over my life, that there are certainly times when apologetics plays a very specific role when you're dealing with a specific acute issue that pops up in your faith or someone else's faith. But if you're not in that moment and yet you decide to study apologetics,
Mm,
I have found, I don't know about you, but when somebody asks me what apologetics is or what we do here at Women in Apologetics, sometimes it can be difficult to describe because it's not like you're digging a well to create water or creating a book or a resource. It's not like you're creating, not necessarily creating something tangible and specific, but
mhm,
the process of learning apologetics is a form of discipleship, which I never really knew existed until I sort of stumbled into it. But what I find is that when you're not in those acute moments, when you're not
mhm.
in a crisis moment, studying apologetics is kind of the flip side of discipleship. It helps you grow your faith in a different way
Yeah.
than reading the Bible and doing what we typically think of as
Mhm.
discipleship activities, going to church, saying your prayers, reading the Bible, doing Bible study with a group, that sort of thing. But it is very much an aspect of discipleship, don't you think?
Completely agree. I think it points to the beauty of God. And anything that helps us enjoy more fully God's beauty is worthwhile. Even if you never reached a single crisis moment, which is not possible, but if you never
Right.
did, just appreciating his beauty is worthwhile in and of itself. I mean, I think about it, it's sort of like studying mathematics. Like you, I mean, you could argue, and there are people today who are making this argument that it's not
Mhm.
exactly always worthwhile to study math because now we have artificial intelligence or Google or whatever else
Sure.
calculators that
Yeah.
can get answers for you. But everybody who has even studied the most rudimentary math, which that would be me, and part of the reason I pursued a career in journalism was because you didn't have to take math classes in college if you were in the communication school. I've never been good at math, but everyone who's studied it to some degree knows the thrill of finally getting a mathematical concept, like seeing it
Yeah.
work, understanding why it worked, and then realizing this will work like this every time you do it. There's something kind of magical about that.
Yes,
I
I agree.
think the same is true about apologetics. It's you learning about the world that God made, which He made it knowable, and He wants us to investigate it. And when we do that, every little peek behind the scenes we get about how it's made and maybe even some of why it's made this way, just is a beautiful thrill. It's a happy thing to learn, and it's a way of getting closer to the mind of the creator and to the heart and mind of Jesus. And that's a source of joy regardless of,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean you discovering how God made the world is not the same as you learning how to make the world yourself. It's just a piece of knowledge that describes him to us more fully, and there is deep joy in that.
Yeah, I've never heard somebody say it quite like that, but I think you're absolutely right. I was a good math student up to a point,
Mhm.
probably my junior or senior year in high school, and then that unfortunately all changed. But I know exactly what you're talking about, the thrill of getting a mathematical concept, because I remember telling people, because they would ask me from time to time, "Why on earth is math one of your favorite,
Right.
subjects?" Because everybody else seemed to dislike it so much. And
Mhm.
I always said it's a little bit like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. Once you know how the pieces fit, they fit. Then there's something that you know for sure. 2 plus 2 is always 4. And so that's something that you can always count on. And I
Mhm.
loved that the pieces of the puzzles fit like that, that I could use it to find my way around. I could use those principles to figure out the problem. And
Yeah.
so I haven't thought about apologetics in those terms up until this point. But you're exactly right. Once you understand that there are certain things that are simply true, then acknowledging them becomes a source of knowledge and a source of
Mhm.
wisdom and a source of
Yes.
confidence in just navigating the world that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even we talk at the Colson Center a lot about gender because this is such a mystery
Sure.
right now for a lot of people. Understand it was just a very rich source of both pain um, and wisdom in some ways. But anyway, all that to say, people are just asking a lot of questions about gender right now. So we've been talking about it a lot. And even that has been a source of joy to really look at the question. So God made us different. He made man and woman. Why might he have done that? And what does it
Right.
mean that he did that? And in that you find, at least I have found such like a richness of like really pride that I'm not a man. He made me a woman, and what makes me different? And also, the fact that God says every human being was made in his image. So what is it about being a woman that reflects the character of God? And what about being a
Mhm.
man reflects the character of God? And why does God refer to himself as a man?
Yeah.
All these sorts of questions are within the realm of apologetics, and they all reveal something about the God who made us, right?
Yes, they do. Absolutely. Since you brought up the Colson Center, I would
Yeah.
actually love if for our viewers and listeners who aren't familiar, it's the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and it was started by a man named Charles Colson, named after him. When did you start with them? How did you get connected to them originally?
Yes. So, yeah, the Colson Center is an incredible organization. As you mentioned, Chuck Colson started it. He
Mhm.
he was sort of he was known as the hatchet man in the Richard Nixon administration. So he was
Oh,
sort of
that's
the
right.
mastermind behind Watergate. He went to prison for the Watergate scandal, and in prison had a really dramatic encounter with Jesus. And when he came out of prison, he started this ministry because he saw that a lot of what ailed people, the people
Yeah.
that he was meeting that were incarcerated, was a lack of a biblical worldview, a lack of a sense of personal meaning, or the
Mhm.
idea that there's meaning in life beyond our own circumstances. And so he started this organization in part because he saw that if we can equip people with the knowledge of God and the knowledge that their lives have meaning, then we could turn the tide on some of this incarceration and
Mhm.
people who are living lives that they feel are meaningless. So he started the organization. He had unfortunately passed by the time I became involved with it. But
Okay.
I had been writing for several years at that point. I'd been writing for World and for Christianity Today, just kind
Okay.
of plodding along in my journalism career. But I met John, who took over after Chuck passed, actually at an event that my husband's organization was hosting. So my husband
Oh.
runs a Christian public policy organization here in Ohio called the Center for Christian Virtue. They do a lot
Hmm.
of political advocacy. It's a nonprofit, but they advocate on behalf of good public policy that reflects the truth of the gospel. That's their mission
Wow.
statement. So,
Mhm.
for example, last year they did a lot of advocacy work on school choice because we see a lot of problems within public schools. And so they want the government to help families if they want to send their kids to private or Christian schools that they can, and that kind of thing. So he had an event and John came and spoke at it. I ended up sitting at John's table that night. And so he and I got to chatting, and he invited me to start writing on the Breakpoint team. So Breakpoint is, again, this was the brainchild of Chuck Colson, but every day they release about a 5-minute commentary just on culture, on what's going on in the world, and talking about it from a Christian worldview perspective. And so I started helping John write some of those commentaries. And then a few years into that, we have such a great rapport. He
Mhm.
would hate me saying this because he's not old enough to be my dad, but sometimes he feels like my dad. And um, so we started hosting this podcast together, which is a weekly hour-long podcast where we sort of talk about the news of the week from a Christian worldview. And
Mhm.
that's we've been doing that now for, I don't know, 3 years, a few years now, since my daughter was my youngest daughter was very young. So yeah, I met him at an event and it just kind
That's
of went.
great.
Yeah.
If you could boil it down, is there something specific, maybe your biggest lesson that you have learned from working at the Colson Center, if it's possible?
Gosh, yeah, that's hard.
Yeah, I
I
bet.
feel like I get to go to seminary every week, which is really fun. And
That's a
sort of
good
the
thought.
way I view my role on the podcast is in part just to ask questions. John is such a gifted teacher, and I get to
Yeah,
sort of look at the news of the week, think of all of my, those questions we were talking about before, like, is this the way the world is? And
right.
how does this fit into scripture and what we know about God? And I get to ask him all those questions. I think probably if I had to boil it down to a theme, it would be somewhat what we've talked about already, which is that
Okay.
the world reveals the truth of the scripture, and um, the world reveals the character of God.
Yeah.
I sort of growing up, I'd sort of imbibed that there was this, I think what a lot of people call the sacred secular divide. So there are God's truths, which are these sort of esoteric, theoretical, like philosophical truths about who we are as people and life after physical death. And that's where spirituality fits in. And then there's just real life. You got to wake up in the morning and pack your kids' lunches. And, there's just the logistics of your day to day life. And those two things don't ever really need to intersect, and they probably don't. I probably would have never put that into words, but that's kind of how
Yeah.
I viewed things. And the more I've sat under John's teaching and been a part of work at the Colson Center, the more I'm seeing this beauty of, everything in God made the physical world just like he made the spiritual world. God is God of the physical world just as he is the spiritual world. And everything we learn reveals his character. There was a we talked a few years ago. I think John was talking about something that Kepler had said. Johann Kepler was a astronomer. Oh, gosh, I don't even know the era. It was several hundred years ago. So a Christian astronomer studying the stars and the planets, and he said science is thinking God's thoughts after him. If I had to say what I've learned most at the Colson Center, it would be that, which is, everything you look at, everything we study is a way of learning about God
I
because he
love
made.
that. That is so beautiful. I loved science too as a kid. I love that. I'm always
Yeah.
fascinated by the world around us, the created
Yeah.
world around us.
Mhm.
So, on that note, before we wrap, as we begin to kind of wrap the episode, can you tell us? There was a conversation that you and I had briefly prior to the show, and I just thought it was such a great question. Can you tell us for what reasons should we attempt to know God as deeply as possible? Since we're on this subject of
Mhm.
knowing God and that the world reveals God, why should we pursue that? Why should we attempt to know God as deeply as possible?
I love this question, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I've had to wrestle with, after having that sort of worldview awakening at Focus on the Family. I spent several years, as a lot of college kids do, thinking that I had really discovered the key to life, and people who weren't
Yeah.
doing it the same way I was doing it were doing it wrong, and everybody should do it the way I'm doing it. And so I was very convicted that, pursuing apologetics and pursuing wisdom in that way, being able to have an explanation for things, or that was the best way. I do see a deep richness in that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I've been convicted over the last couple of years of my pride in that, and been thinking through things like, we know that God, just as God made people to be vastly different from one another. I mean, there's what 8 billion people in the world, and we all look different, we think different, we're very, very different. We have key things in common. We're all made in his image, and we all have inherent worth and dignity. And we all have a calling from him, but we're very different. So there are people with differing mental capacities. There are, I love that you mentioned before that you were an easy sell. You didn't have as many questions maybe as I did. When I was in college, I would have heard you say that and thought, man, I'm so much better than her. Like, person than she is. Now I absolutely do not feel that way. I actually view that
Yeah.
as a gift. I think my questions are a gift, and your kind of your more childlike faith, if you want to put it that way, was a gift as well. I think God, again, this is part of the difference that God made us. So all this to say, I think knowing, like being able to explain math or the math of God's world, or to have these deep philosophical questions or conversations every day, that's not a virtue unless God made you that way. I think he made me this way, and so this is part of my walk with him, is investigating the questions that I have and studying. But I think God made every person to know him as deeply as that person can. And for
Yeah.
every person, that pursuit will look different. So I think a
Yes.
lot about Jesus, telling us to approach him like children, and blessed are those who can approach him like children. That means, in part, I mean, that doesn't mean to never ask questions and to just have blind faith and don't
Sure.
think about it. But I think that means, count it joy if you if you can be content with maybe a quieter thought life. You're not a better person if you have a deeper, more angsty faith than I do. But I also think that, and I think I shared this example with you before. Like when you're a kid, maybe you hear the story of the thief on the cross, right? So the man next to Jesus who says, "Can I come to heaven with you? Can I come be in this place with you?" And Jesus says, "Yes, if you ask, you can." If you're when I read that as a younger person, I remember thinking, "Man, that guy, what a lucky guy." I mean, aside from the crucifixion thing, he got to live
Right?
his whole life however he wanted. He was in the driver's seat. He could just pursue his own pleasure, and then at the very last minute, he got to accept Jesus and go to heaven.
Yeah.
Now I look back on it and think, I pity this person that he had to spend his whole life not knowing the depth of the richness and goodness of God, and without recognizing God's handprints all over his entire
Mhm.
life and all over creation. And what kind of pain and like needless toil did he suffer through in his life because he didn't know God before that moment? And it is a great and merciful God that would still allow him to be in communion with him forever after that one moment of belief. But
Mhm.
it would surely have been a richer and better life if he had spent that time pursuing God. And so that's the way I think of it now. You're not a better person if you spend time, investigating every philosophical and spiritual question that comes to you. Some people don't have that wiring, but I know, at least for me, who does have those questions, it is a much richer life searching for God under every rock than it would
Yeah.
be otherwise.
Yes, I quite agree, and I have never really looked at the thief on the cross, that story, quite that way, but I love how you framed that because it is so true. He went his whole life essentially, starving to death spiritually, and
Mhm.
finally got that nibble just before it was over, and what a difference it would have been had he been fed early on and been able to sustain his life that way the whole time. So that is really beautiful. Honestly, I love that. I love that that way of looking at that story. That's really
Yeah.
helpful. So, like I said before at the beginning of the show, thank you so much for coming on to our show today and sharing with us because you have such a deep and reverential awe for the Lord and a wonderful way of looking at faith and discipleship that it's been a blessing to hear from you today.
It's been such a blessing to be here. I don't necessarily think of myself as like a capital W woman in apologetics. I feel intimidated by y'all, but this has been really life-giving for me. So thank you for having me.
I'm so grateful that you were here with us today. So, if you viewers and listeners would like to learn more about Maria and the Colson Center, you can find her at colsoncenter.org or breakpoint.org, and you can follow her on social media by searching the handle on X at Maria Baer Writes and at Substack. You can find her at mariabaer.substack.com. So if you haven't already, you should visit our website at apologetics.com to find more on our conference and buy tickets. You can find cool stuff like this nifty mug that I love, and t-shirts and other merch. And you can also find our academy courses to help you grow in your discipleship and faith through apologetics. Not to mention, there are articles and videos and recommended reading lists and a whole lot more. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for this video, and we hope to see you in the next one.